Batman would understand the Purge pretty quickly. The rules are simple. The city is about to become extremely violent, and for 12 hours, nobody can rely on police, paramedics, or the usual systems that keep things from getting worse. Bruce would start by finding where people are the most vulnerable, which areas are likely to be hit hardest, and which groups are preparing to take advantage of the chaos. As he starts tracking the violence across the city, he'd also notice that some attacks are far more organized than they should be. That would pull him away from random purgers, and towards the people using the night for something much bigger. Bruce would arrive several hours before the Purge begins, which gives him enough time to understand the rules before the city shuts down. The emergency broadcasts make the basics clear. For 12 hours, almost all crime becomes legal under a small set of government restrictions, while police, firefighters, and emergency medical services stop responding, and the government expects citizens to protect themselves until the sirens sound again the following morning. Bruce has dealt with cities collapsing into chaos before, but this is organized in advance. People know exactly when the violence starts. Businesses have closed early. Wealthy residents are disappearing behind expensive security systems, and anyone without somewhere safe to go is already preparing for the worst. His first few hours would be spent gathering information rather than chasing anyone. Bruce needs to know which neighborhoods have the fewest private defenses, where shelters are operating, what roads are likely to become blocked, and which locations have large numbers of people trapped together. He'd access traffic cameras, public security feeds, emergency infrastructure, and anything else the local network gives him. If he has a back computer and his usual surveillance equipment with him, he can combine all of that into one live map and start predicting where the worst violence is likely to happen before the first siren even sounds. He'd also realize very quickly that normal emergency planning has been deliberately removed from the equation. Hospitals can still contain people, and private medical groups can operate, but anyone bleeding out on a street can't simply call an ambulance and expect help. Fire can spread without a fire department coming to contain it, and a family trapped inside a building may have nobody nearby who is willing to risk leaving shelter to help them. Bruce would start preparing around those gaps, because protecting people tonight means doing some of the work an entire city normally divides between thousands of responders. The Batmobile becomes useful for more than transportation. Bruce can load it with medical supplies, portable communication equipment, restraints, and anything else he needs to establish a temporary safe location as he moves. He'd identify buildings with strong security, limited entrances, and enough space to hold civilians, then connect those places into a route he can repeatedly return to during the night. If he can contact people before the Purge begins, he can direct some of them towards those locations early instead of waiting until they're already being chased. The opening of the Purge would probably be the easiest section of the night for Batman to control, because many of the people coming onto the streets are still ordinary criminals with ordinary weapons. Some have spent weeks preparing, while others are taking advantage of the fact that robbery, assault, and murder suddenly carry no legal consequences. Against Batman, most of those groups wouldn't last very long. Bruce wouldn't waste time chasing individual burglars unless someone is in immediate danger. His surveillance system would prioritize active attacks, groups moving towards occupied homes, and anything likely to produce several casualties if he arrives too late. One armed person breaking into an empty store goes far below a convoy moving towards a residential building with people still inside. His first rescues would also start teaching civilians that there's someone operating outside the rules of the night. Batman can break up an attack, restrain the people involved, and direct survivors towards one of the safe locations he identified earlier. Since there are no police coming to take custody of the attackers, he'd need a temporary way to keep the most violent ones from immediately getting back up and continuing. Reinforced restraints inside secure rooms would work for smaller numbers, while larger groups could be disarmed, immobilized, and left somewhere his cameras can monitor until morning. The Batmobile will let him move between incidents far faster than anyone expects, but even that has limits. Bruce could finish one rescue and immediately see 5 new alerts appear on the Bat computer. He'd have to make decisions based on how many lives are in immediate danger, how far away each attack is, and whether any of them can be stopped remotely. A drone triggering an alarm might scare one group away. Blocking traffic barriers could block another vehicle long enough for civilians to escape. Bruce could even take control of digital billboards or local emergency systems to send warnings into neighborhoods where an armed group is approaching. As the first few hours pass though, the map would begin showing something more useful than individual emergencies. Certain neighborhoods are seeing far more organized activity than others, and some of the groups moving through them don't behave like people who came outside to settle a personal score or enjoy the freedom of the Purge. They're moving systematically, entering specific areas in vehicles, and continuing from one block to another without wasting much time. Batman would start tracking them. Some violence during the Purge is exactly what the government says it is. People attack neighbors, criminals exploit vulnerable businesses, gangs settle disputes, and wealthy participants even pay for opportunities to hunt people who have been captured and sold to them. The Purge anarchy shows victims being abducted and taken to an auction where rich purgers bid for the chance to kill them. Once Batman starts seeing that kind of organization, his priorities would shift, because stopping the groups applying those operations can save far more people than responding after each victim has already been taken. Bruce would follow one of the larger groups instead of immediately attacking them. The surveillance data would let him trace where the vehicles come from, which locations they return to, and whether they're communicating with anyone outside the streets. He'd keep enough distance that they believe they're operating normally, while small trackers on vehicles give him a picture of the larger network. Eventually, one of those routes could lead him to a collection point where kidnapped civilians are being held. That's the kind of target Batman can dismantle quickly once he understands the layout. He'd cut power to selected sections, lock exits remotely, use smoke to separate armed guards, and move through the building before anyone inside can organize a response. Most of the people running an operation like this are dangerous against unarmed civilians, but they aren't prepared for someone with Batman's training controlling the environment around them. He'd copy transaction records, communications, vehicle registrations, security footage, and any list showing where victims came from or who was paying for them. If wealthy purgers are buying people, Bruce wants a financial trail, because money can connect people who never appear together on the street. That evidence also gives him a way to keep investigating once the 12 hours end, when simply wearing a mask and calling something part of the purge no longer protects anyone from what gets exposed publicly. The people he rescues would also need somewhere safe to go for the rest of the night, so Bruce would direct them to the same shelter network he'd already been building. By now, those safe locations would be filling up, and that creates another logistical problem. The more people he concentrates in one place, the more dangerous that location becomes if the wrong group discovers it. Bruce would respond by making the shelters harder to identify from the outside, and changing routes between them. He could cut nearby street cameras from public access, while keeping his own feeds active, disable location data from devices people bring inside, and rotate which buildings he uses as the night progresses. Anyone following survivors would find routes changing before they get a clean location. The first clue would come from how the group chooses targets. They move through poorer neighborhoods with no personal connection to the people they're attacking, ignore easier opportunities elsewhere, and continue killing even when there's nothing to steal. Their vehicles, weapons, and coordination also suggest funding that doesn't fit a random collection of citizens who decided to purge together. That pattern exists because the NFFA has secretly used organized forces to increase the purge's death toll. In the Purge Anarchy, Big Daddy reveals that government-backed death squads are sent into lower income areas because ordinary citizens aren't killing enough people for the NFFA's goals. The OG Staten Island experiment was manipulated in a similar way, with mercenaries sent in after the expected level of violence failed to happen naturally. Bruce wouldn't know any of that yet, but he'd recognize the signs of a coordinated operation once he watches the same unit for long enough. And Bruce wouldn't let an active death squad keep moving just to see where it leads. Once he has enough surveillance to confirm the pattern, he'd stop the unit at the first location where he can do it without putting civilians in the crossfire. He could disable their vehicles before the soldiers know they've been compromised, cut their communications, and use darkness and smoke to prevent them from coordinating. He would also kidnap one of the soldiers for questioning, giving Bruce another source, though he wouldn't expect a soldier at the bottom of the operation to know everything. Now, stopping the squad doesn't end the trail. Bruce can pull storage data from their comm devices, recover route information, identify scheduled check-ins, and compare frequencies, equipment markings, vehicle histories, and command language already captured by his surveillance. If their gear traces back to contractors with government connections, the case gets stronger. But if the same organization appears around several units operating in different parts of the city, Bruce now has evidence of something much larger than one violent group. He can then use a disabled unit's route history and missed check-ins to study how the larger network reacts without leaving the killers free to continue operating. Any rerouted vehicles, replacement orders, or communications triggered by the unit going silent give Bruce another piece of the command structure, while the civilians the squad was targeting are no longer being used as bait. What matters more is their equipment. Batman can pull storage data from comm devices, recover route information, and compare assigned targets against the areas his own map marked as vulnerable before the night began. If the routes consistently lead towards low-income districts and places where people lack expensive security, Bruce can start reconstructing the objective even before he finds a document openly explaining it. That would change how he uses the remaining hours. Protecting civilians is still urgent, but now he knows that some of the largest attacks can be predicted because they're following an organized plan. Every route he uncovers lets him get ahead of another unit. He can evacuate a block before they arrive, disable vehicles while they're still traveling, or feed false information into the network and send a squad towards an empty area. The same investigation would also tell him how deep the problem goes. If these teams are funded or directed by people connected to the NFFA, then the government overseeing the purge is actively shaping the casualty count while publicly presenting the night as violent citizens choose for themselves. The information taken from the first unit will let him predict where some of the others are going. Bruce could begin using their own schedules against them, arriving ahead of planned sweeps and quietly moving residents out through side streets before the attackers appear. In locations where evacuation takes too long, he could create defensive positions instead. Heavy vehicles can be disabled before they reach the block. Streets can be closed with construction equipment or barriers, and lights can be shut off in selected areas while Batman's own equipment continues working in the dark. The groups would immediately realize that someone is interfering with them, but they wouldn't know the scale of it immediately. One team loses contact, another reaches its assigned area and finds nobody there, a third gets redirected by information that appears to have come through the same network it has trusted all night. Bruce wouldn't need to fight every unit because once he gets inside the command system, bad information can waste their time just as effectively. His safe zones would also be operating more efficiently by now, but only as a limited network concentrated in the neighborhoods and routes Bruce can realistically cover during one night. Bruce would identify rescued civilians with useful skills, including medical workers, security personnel, and capable volunteers, and have them actually operate each shelter while he coordinates the network remotely. They can receive new arrivals, organize basic treatment, and monitor entrances while Batman directs civilians towards whichever nearby location currently has the lowest risk. If one shelter appears compromised, he can begin moving people before the threat reaches it rather than waiting for another siege. Now, the pressure on Bruce would still keep increasing as the night continues. Equipment gets damaged, his body takes punishment, and there are limits to how long he can move between fights without slowing down. He also can't assume that everyone he rescues will follow instructions. Some people will refuse to leave their homes, others will head back outside for family members, and a few may even use the safe locations as opportunities to target people once they get inside. Bruce would have to account for that by monitoring entrances and separating anyone carrying weapons until morning. His investigation in the organized attacks would eventually produce the lead he needs. No single transmission would lead Bruce directly to whoever is running the operation. Instead, recovered route data data, synchronized check-ins, vehicle movements, and brief communications blackouts would let him narrow down where multiple units are receiving updated orders. Cross-referencing those patterns would eventually point him towards a local relay on command site. He wouldn't know whether the people there are directly connected to the highest level of the NFFA yet, but whoever is running that operation has access to target lists, deployment routes, and information about where civilians are expected to be throughout the night. Reaching that site becomes his most valuable objective because taking it down could disrupt several units at once. Bruce would still respond to emergencies along the way, but his drones and remote systems can now handle more of the warning work while he moves towards the source. That puts Batman on their radar before he even reaches them, and the second half of the night would become far more dangerous once the people running the Purge start adjusting their plans around him. The command site would be much harder to reach than anything Bruce dealt with earlier, because the people running it already know somebody has been interfering with their teams. By the time he arrives, security would be tighter, communications would be changing more frequently, and several units would already be trying to figure out how the routes were compromised. Bruce would expect that. He has enough recovered equipment by now to understand how the network is structured, so he wouldn't walk into the building relying on surprise alone. He'd start by cutting the command site off from the people outside. Comms go down first, then backup systems, then any local surveillance that could track where he enters. Bruce could then move through the site while copying everything he finds instead of destroying it immediately. No single file would openly explain the entire operation, but target lists, deployment records, contractor information, and fragments of internal communications would all be more valuable after sunrise than another room full of broken equipment. The personnel inside would be much better armed than the ordinary Purgers, but the building itself gives Batman more control than an open street. He can shut sections down remotely, trap teams behind security doors, and force them into narrow routes where numbers stop helping. By now, fatigue would be massively affecting him, so he'd avoid unnecessary fights wherever the building systems can do the work instead. Gas suppression systems, elevators, magnetic locks, and internal power controls can separate people long enough for Bruce to move past them and keep heading towards whoever has access to the highest level of the operation. The evidence he finds there would strengthen what he had already been building towards. None of it says outright that the NFFA ordered civilians killed to raise the death toll, but together the target lists, deployment records, contractor information, and communications establish the pattern. These teams were deliberately routed into vulnerable neighborhoods, and the orders traced back through the organizations tied to the NFFA. Bruce would still need to verify those connections after sunrise before he could prove the full case publicly. That changes what he could accomplish by morning. Taking down the local command center would immediately disrupt several active teams, but destroying the whole system is impossible in the few hours he has left. Before leaving, Bruce would copy valid command credentials and active authentication tokens from the site's hardware. That gives him a limited window to send false orders, cancel routes, and redirect units away from occupied areas while his access still appears legitimate, even though he knows the NFFA will eventually revoke it once they understand the breach. So the NFFA would realize somebody inside the network is actively sabotaging it, and at that point, they stop treating Batman as another unpredictable civilian threat. Once the NFFA understands that Batman has reached this command structure, the response would become much more focused. The government has already lost teams, routes have been compromised, and now someone has access to records that could expose why those teams were deployed in the first place. Keeping Batman away from civilians is no longer the priority. Recovering the data becomes more important. Instead of spreading through vulnerable neighborhoods, several units begin converging towards his location and the routes he uses between safe zones. That actually gives him one advantage because every team pulled towards Batman is one less team hunting civilians somewhere else. Bruce can use that pressure to lead them away from populated areas while continuing to feed his shelter network's warnings through the Bat computer. The fight itself would be harder than anything from the first half of the night. These teams would be prepared for him now. They'd use heavier weapons and coordinate their fire and try to limit the darkness and vertical movement Batman normally relies on. Bruce would still be better trained than anyone they send, but he'd have to keep changing tactics because the NFFA has spent the last several hours learning from every team he defeated. He'd rely more heavily on vehicles and remote systems here. The Batmobile can survive attacks that would stop an ordinary car and gives him a way to move through blocked streets without getting trapped. Drones can draw fire away from his position or force teams to reveal where they're hiding. If the NFFA tries to lock down roads, Bruce can use alternative routes that he mapped earlier or simply turn their own traffic controls against them. This would also be the point where his physical condition starts becoming a real factor. He's been fighting, driving, climbing, and moving between emergencies for hours without meaningful rest. Even Batman slows down eventually, and one mistake against an organized team could still kill him. Bruce would become more selective about when he personally enters a fight, saving direct intervention for situations where nobody else can get out without him. The NFFA's decision to concentrate on Batman would create a strange effect across the city. Violence would still be happening everywhere, but the organized killing would begin collapsing because the same people who were supposed to carry it out are now chasing one man through empty streets. Bruce would keep using that. He'd deliberately let false sightings circulate, send drones through different districts, and create enough uncertainty that the government can't tell which report is real. Every minute spent chasing the wrong target burns through the last hours of the Purge. So the final stretch of the Purge would be the most dangerous for people still outside because anyone who has spent all night hunting knows the clock is running out. Bruce would expect attacks to become less organized and more desperate as the end gets closer, especially from groups trying to reach one last target before the sirens sound. His network would be doing most of the heavy lifting by this period. The safe zones are established, the routes between them are mapped, and his surveillance has enough history from the night to predict which streets are becoming dangerous. Bruce could start moving moving people in larger groups instead of handling every rescue individually. One of the biggest priorities would be protecting the evidence. Bruce would never keep the only copy on himself once he knows the NFFA wants it back. He could distribute encrypted copies across several remote systems, store pieces of it in separate locations, and make sure destroying the back computer doesn't erase everything he collected. If he gets captured or killed before morning, the material still has to survive. That makes the last hour less about winning fights and more about keeping the system stable until the clock runs out. Bruce would be moving between the highest risk locations, checking that nobody has compromised the shelters, and using whatever equipment remains to keep the worst groups away from civilians. Then the sirens eventually sound. People who were trying to kill each other minutes earlier suddenly have legal consequences again, and emergency services start returning. For most of the city, that marks the end of the nightmare. Bruce would already be thinking about what comes next. He spent a full night watching the NFFA use government resources to shape who dies, and now he has records to prove it. The NFFA itself requires a longer fight. Bruce now has evidence that the government has manipulated the Purge and sent armed teams into vulnerable communities, but exposing that evidence has to be done carefully. If he simply hands one copy to the first news outlet he finds, the NFFA could deny it, discredit the source, or shut the story down before the public understands what they're looking at. So Batman will build a case, the same way he handles corruption in Gotham. He'd verify the records against independent financial data, identify people whose names appear repeatedly in the command structure, and connect the operational files to real deaths and real locations from the night. Survivors from the areas targeted by the government could confirm what happened on the ground, while the digital evidence shows who sent the units there. Bruce would also understand that exposing a few officials wouldn't automatically destroy the Purge. The policy has supporters, corporations profit from the security industry around it, and the NFFA has built an entire political identity around convincing people that the night is necessary. Ending it requires enough evidence to make continued support politically and legally dangerous. So Batman would survive the Purge and make the night far less effective wherever he could reach. His real advantage would come from refusing to treat 12 hours of violence as 12 hours of random crime. Once he starts tracking the patterns, the Purge becomes an operation he can eventually trace back to the people directing it. He couldn't protect an entire country by himself during one night, but he could gather enough evidence to make sure that the next Purge becomes much harder for the NFFA to justify. And once Bruce Wayne starts working on the system behind it, the people running the Purge would have a much bigger problem than one vigilante stopping criminals in the streets.